Imagine this. You're fast asleep in bed next to the person you love. The home is silent, the world outside still. But then, in the dead of night, everything changes. At 3:30 a.m. on February 21st, 2008 in Minden, Nevada, a horrifying crime takes place. Ben Oxley, a devoted father, is found murdered, shot at point-blank range in his own bed. His wife, Melissa Oxley, wakes up to a nightmare. She's covered in blood. Her husband is dead beside her. But what's even more terrifying? She has no idea what happened. The police arrive and there's only one explanation that makes sense to them. Melissa did it. She was right there. She was unharmed. She had to be the killer. But they're wrong. What they don't know is that someone else was awake that night. Someone small, someone innocent. A 6-year-old girl, and what she saw would change everything. Before tragedy struck, Ben Oxley's life was centered around one thing: his daughter, Alyssa. Living in the quiet town of Minden, Nevada, Ben was a devoted single father, doing everything he could to rebuild his life after a difficult divorce from Dawn Oxley. Though the separation was messy, one thing remained clear: Alyssa was his world. At first, Ben shared custody, splitting time with his ex-wife. But whenever Alyssa was with him, he made sure their time together was unforgettable. One of their most cherished moments was a Valentine's Day father-daughter dance. As the song Butterfly Kisses played, Ben held his little girl close, twirling her around the dance floor, promising to always be there for her. But Ben wasn't just a father, he was also a man looking for love. That's when he met Melissa. From the moment they connected, sparks flew. Their relationship blossomed quickly, but Ben knew that if Melissa was going to be a part of his life, she also had to be a part of Alyssa's. So on their very first date, Ben brought Alyssa along.
Our first date, Alyssa was there. Alyssa's like, "Don't talk to my dad."
I remember meeting her. I didn't really like her.
At first, Alyssa wasn't thrilled about sharing her father's love with someone new, but Melissa didn't push. Instead, she patiently built a relationship with the little girl, one rooted in care, understanding, and time. By September 17, 2006, Ben and Melissa stood at the altar, ready to start their new life together. But their wedding day wasn't just about them, it was about Alyssa too. In a heartwarming moment, Melissa bent down and fastened a delicate bracelet around Alyssa's tiny wrist. Engraved on it was a promise that she would always love her as her own daughter. From that day forward, they weren't just a couple, they were a family. Shortly after their marriage, Ben and Melissa were granted full custody of Alyssa, removing Dawn from her life entirely. Their home now included Melissa's younger brother, Craig, a teenager living with them at the time. For the first time in years, Ben, Melissa, and Alyssa had the life they had always dreamed of. They had no idea that in just 2 years, it would all come crashing down. For all appearances, the Oxley household was happy. A loving father, a devoted stepmother, and a bright young girl who finally had the stability she needed. But beneath the surface, trouble was brewing. No one inside that house could have predicted that in the early hours of February 21st, 2008, their lives would change forever. At exactly 3:30 a.m., a frantic 911 call was placed from the Oxley home. Melissa Oxley's voice trembled as she spoke.
911, address of your emergency.
I was sleeping. I turned on the light to wake up my husband, and it's really, really bad.
She had been sleeping beside Ben, but now she was drenched in his blood. Her husband was motionless, his head blown apart by a shotgun blast. And yet, she had heard nothing. When police arrived, the house was eerily silent, as if time had stopped. Then they noticed something chilling. The front door was wide open. Slowly they moved through the house, their flashlights cutting through the darkness. In the hallway stood Melissa, frozen in shock, clutching a terrified 6-year-old Alyssa in her arms. A few doors down, her teenage brother Craig lay asleep in his bed, seemingly unaware of the horror unfolding just a few feet away. The Oxley home had become a crime scene. Ben was gone, executed in his sleep. Melissa stood motionless, her hands and clothes soaked in his blood. And Alyssa, only 6 years old, clung to her stepmother, trembling. The air was thick with tension. Officers scanned the house, but something about the scene didn't add up. No forced entry, no signs of struggle, no missing valuables. Whoever had done this hadn't needed to break in. Police didn't have to look far for their first suspects. Melissa under suspicion. At the station, Melissa Oxley sat across from detectives, still in shock. Her hands trembled as she wiped at dried blood on her arms. Her husband was murdered while lying right next to her, and yet she was completely unharmed.
Why somebody shoots him might not see anything.
I don't know. I don't know.
Sometimes people know more than they want to tell or share. And I really did all.
I don't know.
It's the worst feeling thinking that you're gonna blame for your husband's death.
It didn't make sense. How could someone sleep through a shotgun blast fired just inches away? Melissa wasn't just a witness anymore. She was their prime suspect, Craig's suspicious bedroom discovery. But there was someone else in the house that night. 17-year-old Craig, Melissa's younger brother, had been asleep in his room just down the hall. At first, police didn't think much of it until they searched his bedroom. On Craig's nightstand, they found 2 shotgun shells. And Craig wasn't just any teenager, he was a hunter. He knew how to use a firearm. He had access to a shotgun. And Ben Oxley had been killed with a shotgun. Now, Craig wasn't just a bystander, he was a suspect.
I was pretty tired last night. I was in a pretty deep sleep. Even when I got there, I didn't even know what was going on really.
So you didn't hear anything?
No, my doors were shut.
Did you kill Ben?
I did not.
The detectives weren't convinced until they tested his hands for gunpowder residue. The results came back negative. Craig hadn't fired a weapon that night. And just like that, the investigation hit a wall, Alyssa's heartbreaking pleas. While police tried to figure out who had pulled the trigger, little Alyssa sat alone in another room. Her face was pale, her small hands gripping the edge of her chair. She didn't understand why people kept asking questions. She didn't understand why they wouldn't let her see her father. She just wanted to go home. "I want to see Daddy." Melissa gently shook her head, holding her close. "You can't, sweetheart." Alyssa didn't know the truth yet. She didn't know that her father was never coming home. And no one knew yet that she was the only person in that house who had seen something that night. Something that would change everything. For weeks, the investigation felt stuck. There were no weapons, no fingerprints, no clear evidence pointing to a killer. Police had their suspicions, but without proof, Melissa and Craig walked free. Still, the town wasn't convinced. Rumors spread like wildfire. Melissa did it for the insurance money. Craig did it in a fit of rage. Someone inside the house had to be guilty. But then, everything changed. But then, detectives returned to the only person who might have seen something that night, Alyssa. At just 6 years old, she had lost the only father she had ever known. She had been kept away from the crime scene, shielded from the full horror of what had happened in that bedroom. But there was one thing no one had asked her yet. Had she been awake? At first, Alyssa hesitated. She was just a child. Her world had been shattered overnight. But as she sat with investigators, her small voice finally broke the silence. "I wasn't asleep that night." The detective leaned in. "What do you mean, sweetheart?" Alyssa's little hands gripped the edge of her chair. She swallowed hard, then spoke the words that would change everything. "I saw someone come in." Alyssa had woken up in the middle of the night. Something had startled her. The house had been so quiet, but then a noise. She remembered hearing a soft creak, the unmistakable sound of the front door opening. And when she peeked out from her bed, she saw it, a shadowy figure moving through the house. "Did you see their face?" She shook her head. "No, they were in the dark, but they stopped. They looked at me." A dark silhouette, standing still, watching her. Then, as quietly as they had entered, they turned away, disappearing into the hallway. Minutes later, her father was dead. The detectives exchanged glances. Melissa and Craig had both been inside the house that night. Neither of them had gone in or out of that door, which meant only one thing. The killer wasn't in the house already. They had come from outside, and that meant they could have left without a trace. For the first time since the investigation had begun, police had a new lead. The killer wasn't Melissa. The killer wasn't Craig. The killer had been watching, waiting, moving in the darkness. And now they had a name in mind. As detectives expanded their search, they uncovered a new detail that set the town ablaze. Ben Oxley had a $400,000 life insurance policy. And Melissa? She was the sole beneficiary. The whispers grew louder. She killed him for the money. She knew exactly what she was doing. She played the grieving widow perfectly. But there was one problem. Melissa had no idea the policy existed. If she didn't know about the money, then what was the motive? With no arrest made, the court ruled that Alyssa would be placed back into the custody of her biological mother, Ben Oxley. Just like that, Melissa lost the daughter she had promised to love forever. Alyssa was sent to live with Dawn and her boyfriend, James Matlen. It should have been a homecoming, but it didn't feel like one. Despite the whispers, the accusations, the world telling her otherwise, Alyssa never doubted Melissa's innocence. She knew what real love felt like, and what she was about to experience in her mother's home was anything but. As Alyssa re-entered her mother's world, police dug into Dawn's past. What they found wasn't the life of a loving, grieving mother. It was a history of neglect, crime, and addiction. Dawn Oxley had been in and out of jail for drug possession, for DUI, for domestic violence. She had lost custody of Alyssa years earlier because of her unstable lifestyle, and she had never forgiven Ben for it. To her, he had stolen her child, and he had made her pay child support for a daughter she could no longer see. It was a deep, burning resentment, one that festered for years. And now that Ben was dead, Alyssa was back in her life. Was that a coincidence, or was it something much darker? Dawn had gotten exactly what she wanted after Ben's death. Alyssa back in her custody, but detectives weren't convinced this was just a tragic coincidence. She had years of resentment toward Ben. He had taken full custody of Alyssa. He had won in court, forcing Dawn to pay child support. He had moved on, remarried, and built a happy family without her. Was his murder the final act of revenge? To rattle her, police launched open surveillance. Dawn and her boyfriend, James Matlen, were suddenly being watched everywhere they went. Marked police cars tailed them through town. Officers stood outside their house, making their presence known. It wasn't just about gathering evidence, it was psychological pressure. And it worked. James Matlen had claimed that on the night of the murder, he was home with Dawn the entire time. But when investigators dug deeper, they found a crack in his alibi. Security footage from a convenience store early that morning. James was there, not at home. His story began to unravel.
What do you think I lied to you about?
In that first interview, when I originally asked you if you had gone out of the house that night, you told me no.
Okay.
You made up a big story about how you guys watched movies all night long, how you passed out on the couch, how you, et cetera, et cetera. You went on about that. Later, I found out through surveillance video that you were at 7-Eleven.
One day, Dawn's teenage son, Devin, walked into the police station. His face was pale, his hands shaking. I need to tell you something. For years, he had been caught in the middle of his mother's hatred toward Ben. He had heard her rant about him endlessly. He ruined my life. I shouldn't have to pay him a dime. I should just make him disappear. At the time, Devin hadn't thought much of it, but now he realized his mother had meant every word. And Ben's murder wasn't random. It was planned. With Dawn's own son testifying against her, police turned up the heat on James. He was the weak link, and under hours of relentless questioning, he finally broke. His confession was as chilling as it was revealing. Dawn was the mastermind. She planned everything. She convinced James to pull the trigger. She waited in the car, ready for a quick getaway. It had been a cold, calculated execution. And yet, it was almost worse than that, because James had confessed to something even more disturbing. James hadn't just killed Ben that night. He had stepped toward Melissa. He had pointed the shotgun at her. His finger hovered over the trigger. For a moment, he was ready to end her life too. But then he hesitated. Something stopped him. A flicker of doubt. A split-second decision. And instead of pulling the trigger again, he turned and ran. James's confession confirmed Alyssa's worst fear. The shadowy figure she had seen that night, the dark silhouette standing in her doorway, it had been her own mother. Dawn Oxley had stood in her daughter's bedroom moments before her father was murdered. And in that moment, Alyssa had unknowingly looked into the eyes of a killer. For 4 years, the murder of Ben Oxley remained a tangled mystery. Speculation, accusations, dead ends. But now there was no doubt. With James Matlen's confession, detectives had everything they needed. It was time for justice. The arrest on a cold January morning, police surrounded Dawn Oxley's home. As they stepped inside, Dawn barely reacted. She had spent years believing she had gotten away with it. But now, her time was up. She and James were both arrested. The woman who once swore she'd get Alyssa back no matter what was now being charged with her father's murder. And Alyssa? She was finally free. For the first time since that terrible night, she was reunited with the only person who had ever truly loved her, Melissa. After years of heartbreak, stepmother and daughter were together again. But their battle wasn't over yet. January 31st, 2012. 4 years after Ben's murder, Melissa and Alyssa sat in a courtroom, face to face with the people who had destroyed their lives. James Matlen, Ben's killer. Ben Oxley, the woman who orchestrated it all. Melissa took the stand first. She had waited years for this moment. She turned to face the man who had stolen her husband, Alyssa's father. Her voice was steady, but every word cut like a blade.
Emotionally, the damage you have caused me is almost unbearable. For Alyssa, you crumbled her foundation and everything she knew to be right and true.
The courtroom was silent. Then Devin, Dawn's own son, stood to testify. He told the court everything. The years of neglect, the hatred she spewed toward Ben, the manipulation that had led to his death. In the audience, Alyssa watched, wide-eyed. Her mother, the woman who had brought her into this world, had taken her father out of it. But then, Dawn did something no one expected. She turned on James. To save herself, she agreed to testify against him, cutting a deal that gave her immunity from a murder charge. James, now left without options, pleaded guilty to first-degree murder. His sentence? Life without parole. Ben Oxley finally had justice. But Dawn, she escaped a murder conviction. Instead, she was sentenced only for lesser charges, including parole violations, domestic battery, and DUI. She would spend years in prison, but she would eventually walk free. Justice had been served, but not completely. For Alyssa, it wasn't about revenge. It was about healing. And now, with Melissa by her side, she finally had a chance to begin again. For years, Alyssa Oxley's life had been shaped by loss, betrayal, and unthinkable tragedy. At just 6 years old, she had witnessed the aftermath of her father's murder. She had been forced to live with the very people responsible for his death. She had been told lies about the woman who truly loved her. And yet, despite it all, she never lost faith in Melissa. When the trial ended, Alyssa had a final request, something no one saw coming. She wanted to speak to James Matlen, the man who had taken her father away, the man who had almost taken Melissa too.
I told him that I decided to forgive him and that I wanted him to have hope.
At just 10 years old, Alyssa understood something that many people never do, that holding on to hate wouldn't bring her father back. Her decision wasn't about James, it was about herself. She refused to let anger define her future. Instead, she chose healing. She chose love. Melissa had once made a promise on her wedding day that she would love and care for Alyssa as her own daughter. And despite everything that had happened, she kept that promise. She and Alyssa built a new life together, but they didn't stop there. Because in an act of extraordinary compassion, Melissa made another decision. She welcomed Brandy, Dawn's other daughter, into their family as well. Brandy, like Alyssa, had lost her sense of home, and Melissa wasn't going to let another child be left behind. They became a family bound not by blood, but by love. Years have passed since that tragic night in February 2008. Alyssa is no longer that little girl peeking out into the darkness. She has grown, learned, and healed. But no matter where life takes her, her father is still with her.
I miss him a lot. I think he still loves me and that I'm doing much better than I was at my other house.
She carries him in her heart, in her memories, in the family he left behind. And in the home that she and Melissa built together, Ben Oxley's love will never fade. Because love, real love, is the kind that lasts forever. The story of Ben Oxley is one of love, loss, and resilience. It's a reminder that tragedy doesn't just break people, it can also bring them together. Through unimaginable pain, Alyssa found the strength to forgive. Through relentless accusations, Melissa never gave up on the daughter she promised to love. And through it all, Ben's memory has never faded. This case is closed, but stories like this happen far too often. That's why we bring you real cases, real voices, and real justice. If you want to hear more stories of survival, justice, and the human spirit, don't forget to subscribe. Hit the notification bell so you never miss an episode. Like this video if Ben's story touched you. Comment below. What are your thoughts on Alyssa's incredible journey? Share this video to keep Ben's story alive. Because every time we remember these victims, we ensure that their voices are never silenced. This has been True Crime Revealed. Thank you for watching. Stay safe, stay aware, and we'll see you in the next case.